want to dedicate this cycle to my daughter Sarah. Were it not for her going in a mystery, I would not be doing this now. I fully intended to retire and just write, but I'm doing this because of her legacy of something yet unfinished. And so whatever merit comes from this, may it help her return. This education is a 21st century education. Our species is evolving from a single planet-centered species to a species that will inhabit the entire star system. And the base for the next phase of humanity will be as inhabitants of a star system. And for the next 5 or 6 millenniums, our particular species will be characterized not by geographical terrain, but by stellar terrain. And so this education is meant to pull together the entire heritage of this particular planet and to integrate it and differentiate it in a limited sequence so that an individual can make available for themselves at least the introductory interfaces that are necessary for being a planetary person who is capable of a stellar civilization. Now that's a big task. It has nothing to do with preparing people for jobs. It has nothing to do with preparing people to be clerks in any particular culture. And it has nothing to do with adjusting a personality to some kind of standard of psychological expectation. What it does have to do with is a very mysterious process. It's a double process. And in the wisdom tradition, this double process was always presented together. For educational purposes, I separate the two processes in terms of our sequence of approach, but allow for the interpenetration of the two modes at all points along the development. The first year is characterized by integration. And integration is simply pulling together, bringing together, folding together, making a togetherness where there was a disparateness before. The most radical idea in this particular first year of integration, and the second year is all about differentiation, but this first year of integration, the radical idea is that we do not begin with 1, but we begin with 0. So that we would characterize this integration as a zero-based integration. Now, it's very important. As we will see, the Chinese, the ancient Chinese, the Chinese at the beginning of their civilization some 5,000 years ago, by happenstance or by genius, either way, hit upon a fundamental insight which has served them well throughout their entire civilization. And the insight was that the fundamental quality of reality is an unmeasurable Tao. And so in order to begin our education, I'm going to use the I Ching, which presents the ancient Chinese integration cycle as purely and as excellently as one would wish. But in order to stay away from a very tragic pitfall, the pitfall is for the ego to be bloated by a sense of premature accomplishment, for the egotistical mind to leap to conclusions in terms of the power of ideas and use ideation to bulldoze its way through life, to forestall these kinds of tendencies, I pair all of the materials that we use so that there is always a mediating, not a halting, but a mediating quality to whatever it is that we're looking at. The pairing of texts, as it were, putting a pair of texts together, allows for a sense of resonance to be required rather than a sense of definiteness. As we move into integration, it becomes much, much more important to wean ourselves away from definition and its attendant entrapment in terms of the idea of identity, which is an egotistical projection in the first place. And to, instead of working with definition, to work with resonance. The boundaries, the bounds of resonance are a quality of vibration that finally achieves fullness, which we would call consonance. The musical term is consonance. And so we are going to learn integration in terms of consonances rather than in terms of definitions. We don't need to have anything other than bringing ourselves each Saturday morning to play and allow for the flow of this matrix to occur. All of the work has been done. Just simply show up and simply be here. And the appeals, the cues, the inklings and insights will work their own way. The projects which we do, the various junctures of activity which we accomplish, are the true context rather than the books. Now, I set books as the fundamental language of the explication process. That is to say, all of our progress, as it were, all of our sequencing is in terms of books. And this is to take advantage of the form of the mind and the form of the civilization which we inherit. Our minds, our civilization, are formed on books. The ancient Greek word was the codex. And because all of the information of the last 2,000 years is encoded in a codex-related assumptive process, we can access that heritage much easier if we just use as our interface the fact, the structure, the use of the book. We are in no way limited to the book. And by pairing the books again, we take ourselves out of the rather sophomoric level of having texts. If you would like to put a term on this, some kind of definition term, this is a kind of an educational karate. We're going to break through ideational barriers that always occur as resistances in learning by simply penetrating those resistance barriers before we come upon them. The martial arts expert knows that the cry of victory precedes the hand. In ancient Homeric times, the Homeric warrior gave a victory cry to vanquish his foe before the sword ever touched him. In Alexandrian literary criticism, that particular victory cry of the Homeric warrior was referred to as boinegeres. The only place other than Alexandrian literary criticism where that word appears is in the New Testament. It's the word that Jesus uses to describe St. John and his brother. He says, of them, he characterizes them as those who are capable of voinageres, of uttering the victory cry, of using a language which vanquishes resistance before the resistance is even had. It's usually translated as sons of thunder, but this is due to 19th century New Testament Greek scholars who have no understanding of Alexandrian scholarship. This language that I use is designed, as it were, planned, as it were. It has an architectonic, that is to say, it develops a kind of a form, but the form, instead of being definitions, which statically are there, will be resonances that culminate in consonances that flow and occur. So rather than being there, rather than looking to an achievement which is here, we're looking towards junctures which occur. And there's a kind of a fluid quality to this. I've paired with the I Ching Thoreau, and I'm using the portable Thoreau because it has the best selection available. And in Thoreau, the very first thing which we're going to take a look at is Thoreau's walking. When Thoreau was in his late 40s and dying of a tubercular condition, he was suddenly very famous, and the Atlantic Monthly began to ask for articles from him. And Thoreau was too ill to write anything tailor-made for the magazine. And so he went to a series of journals which he had kept for more than 20 years. And out of his journals, he made extracts. This is the beginning extract of the essay called Walking. And I think that we'll begin our course, our education, with Thoreau's words. He wrote about 130 years ago, I wish to speak a word for nature. And notice that our education begins with nature, not nature as things, but nature as a matrix of change, hence the use of the Book of Changes, hence the use of Thoreau, who understood nature as not being there, but as occurring everywhere. I wish to speak a word for nature, for absolute freedom and wildness, as contrasted with a freedom and culture merely civil, to regard man as an inhabitant or a part and parcel of nature rather than as a member of society. I wish to make an extreme statement. If so, I may make an emphatic one. For there are enough champions of civilization, the minister and the school committee, and every one of you will take care of that. I have met with but one or two persons in my entire life who understood the art of walking. That is, of taking walks, who had a genius, so to speak, for sauntering, which word is beautifully derived from, and the definition that he gives, idle people who roved about the country in the Middle Ages, asking charity under the pretense of going à la sentière, to the Holy Land, till children would exclaim, there goes a sentièr, a saunterer, a Holy Lander. They who never go to the Holy Land in their walks, as they pretend, are indeed mere idlers and vagabonds. But they who do go there are saunterers in the good sense, such as I mean. Some, however, would derive the words from sans terre, without land, without a home, which therefore in the good sense will mean having no particular home, but equally at home everywhere. One is reminded of the rather Zen statement of Jesus, birds have their place and fish have their place, but the Son of Man has no place to rest his head. Not a lamenting cry, but an observation of being at home everywhere. The historical Buddha, encouraged by his example of having no permanent residence, no home, of being at home everywhere. The medieval formulation of God was that God is a circle whose center is everywhere. Thoreau concludes in this introduction to walking with this observation. For this is the secret of successful sauntering. He who sits still in a house all the time may be the greatest vagrant of all. But the saunterer in the good sense is no more vagrant than the meandering river, which is all the while sedulously seeking the shortest course to the sea. But I prefer the first, which indeed is the most probable derivation, for every walk is a sort of crusade preached by some Peter the Hermit in us, to go forth and reconquer this holy land from the hands of the infidels, the holy land of being at home everywhere, from the infidels who say, you have one place where you belong, or one role that you should stay in, or one identity which is egotistically equal to you. Thoreau writes, it is true, we are but faint-hearted crusaders, even the walkers nowadays, who undertake no persevering, never-ending enterprises. Our expeditions are but tours, and come round again at evening to the old hearthside from which we have set out. Half the walk is but retracing our steps. We should go forth on the shortest walk, perchance, in the spirit of undying adventure, never to return, prepared to send back our embalmed hearts only as relics to our desolate kingdoms. If you are ready to leave mother and father, brother and sister, and wife and child and friends, and never see them again, if you have paid your debts, made your will, settled all your affairs, and are a free man, then you are ready for a walk. And so our first assignment, our first project, will be to take a walk in Thoreau's sense. Start from wherever you live, and if you're not used to my technique, this is an assignment for next week. Take a walk from wherever you live in some kind of circumambulation. The only stipulation for this walk is that whatever direction you go in at first, and you take your walk and come back home, make some kind of record of that walk, of what you did, of what you saw, of what you felt, of just that walk. And then when you have finished writing down the record, a page or so, of that walk, go out of your door and go the opposite way and go an equal distance and then return back to your house. And make a record of that, so that you will have a walk that is shaped like butterfly wings. You will have gone the two different directions and come back to the same place. Started from the same place, gone out in different directions, and come back to the same place. if we begin somewhere and we end in the same somewhere, the beginning and the end are a pair. And if we begin and end twice, we have a pair of pairs. And a pair of pairs is the ancient wisdom formulation of the true square. And with that true square, we can establish a geometry of the spirit. The presence of wherever it is that you live will be your beginning and your end, both times, so that we will, by this simple assignment, begin to make a taproot of wherever it is that you live, or wherever it is that you are when you take your first walk. Bring those descriptions with you next Saturday, and we'll make some time to share some of them, or we will make copies of all of them so that everyone has a little sheaf, a little folder, and this will be the way that this course begins for you. You don't have to read anything. If you'd like, you could get a copy of the Portable Thoreau and read walking. If not, let it be. Now, paired with Thoreau is the I Ching. And just as Thoreau begins a walk by sauntering, the I Ching begins its divination of what we would call the reality of the true. Not divination to find out what's going to happen. The I Ching is, in a sophomoric way, used in that sense, to find out what's going to happen. But the ancient Chinese Taoist understanding is that the I Ching locates the reality of the present. And once one knows the reality of the present, including its momentum, one then knows the future, not as a future of some kind of bounded, defined, static there-ness which we are approaching, but we know it intimately as a moving resonance of our true occurrence. This is a Taoist outlook, and has nothing to do with the false empiricism imputed to it by 20th century Western critics. I once, in the early 70s, hosted a busload of Chinese engineers in Canada, in Calgary, Alberta. And this bus drove up. It was a private house in the wealthiest section of Calgary, and the engineer friend of mine was of Turkish descent, and he was from Diyarbakir, the same area that Gurdjieff was from. And he was hosting these Chinese, and so I was helping him because he didn't have much experience with Chinese. I was teaching in Canada at the time. And out of this bus came 42 men, all over 6 feet tall. The idea of the Cantonese laundry boy Chinese went out the window immediately from the other Canadians who were around. Short-cropped gray hair, like butch haircuts, black Mao jackets with just the red star at the collar, and in came these enormous, stalwart, athletic-looking men, and sat around and cemented in the entire living room of this enormous house. And on the table in front of them, I had placed a copy of the I Ching and a copy of the biographical dictionary of Republican China. Not one single Chinese lifted the I Ching. They pored over the biographical dictionary because they had had no information on who and what had happened. And the whole night, not a single one of them lifted up the I Ching because they didn't know what it was. They knew nothing about it. And as far as they were concerned, it was old-fashioned, pre-People's Republic China that should be thrown away with the dust. This was a time when by the records of Princeton University Press, who published the I Ching. More than 2.5 million copies of the I Ching had sold in the United States alone. We're the Taoists. No. We're the ones who understand this. Out of all the Chinese intellectuals that I have met, I have only met 2 real Taoists. My teacher and Master Ni. Other than that, I have never met a Chinese who even knew how to begin approaching the I Ching. So relax and take it easy. When it comes to the I Ching, you don't have to know how to read Chinese, but you do know how to be here, and you have some clue now as to how we're going to let that being play. And that's all we need. Remember that Thoreau wanted to make a radical statement about freedom and wildness. That observation in Thoreau's Walking was echoed about 10 years later by Walt Whitman. After Thoreau had passed on, after Lincoln had died, the aging Whitman, who suffered from a physical characteristic that prematurely aged him, so that by the time Whitman was 50, he was almost like 70 in his physiology. And when Whitman was 51, he wrote a book called Democratic Vistas. And in the very beginning, echoing Thoreau, with whom he had had conversations in New York City about 10 years before, about the time the Atlantic Monthly was asking for an article, and about the time that Thoreau sent Walking to the magazine, Whitman observed at the beginning of his estimate of the United States, trying to bring the energies of Lincoln's vision back into an America that was swiftly degenerating into the carpetbagger Reconstruction havoc which reigned for about a generation. Whitman observed at the very beginning, echoing Thoreau, in Democratic Vistas, that nature seems to respect only 2 qualities, freedom and variation. That Mother Nature loves freedom and variation. And she encourages in the natural person freedom and variation. Thoreau's freedom and wildness. So that one does not find definition anywhere in nature. One does not find boundedness in nature. Those forms, those natural forms, which seem to service to contain, always have an osmosis quality to them. They are membranes rather than walls. And we will discover towards the end of the second year of this course that the very structure of the walls of the cell are like resonant membranes that allow for the whole volume of the cell to be real in terms of the permeability of the so-called defining cell wall. And that the so-called defining cell wall will be a bilayer, a paired layer of lipids, fat, and that there will be only 2 qualities. One will be hydrophobic and one will be hydrophilic, water-loving and water-hating, so that the permeability will be on the basis of a stasis between water that flows and water that does not flow, between a oneness with water and a zeroness with water. And that the whole principle of organic structure, right up through nature, including the neuronal structure of the mind, is all based on what the I Ching initially identifies as a movement and a stillness, a oneness and a zeroness. And that somehow the oneness and the zeroness play osmotically together in such a way that the expression of all of their play, the permutations of all of their play, characterize an expression which we would call nature, or which in a deeper sense we would say of this scope of occurrence, that this is the real. What is important and radical in the I Ching at the origins of Chinese civilization was the insight that 0 and 1 are a pair, that they function together, they generate together reality, and that reality is not an extension of the 1, but it is a resonance of the play between the 1 and 0. This insight allowed the Chinese 5,000 years ago to make a tremendous jump out of a kind of Paleolithic horizon into what we would call civilization. And the very first Chinese civilization was a dynasty called the Xia, founded by 5 legendary kings. In Chinese civilization, we will find again and again the number 5. Not just that one has 5 fingers on a hand, or that there were 5 legendary kings, or that there are 5 elements, or 5 musical notes, a pentatonic scale, but that this 5ness characterizes what the Chinese call an energy cycle, an ecology of the current of movement, and that this ecology of the current of movement is held integrally together by its common ratioed relation to the 0. And so the 0 quality will always be the hub of movement. Stillness will always be the pivot upon which movement occurs in Chinese thought. And for the Chinese, the movement, that quality is characterized by the term yang, yang. And that quality which accepts the movement, characterized by the term yin. So that whenever this hand is moving, it is both yin and yang at the same time. The hand's movement is yang. The space generated by the acceptance of the hand moving is the yin. As we mentioned before, the most powerful force for breaking through a resistance is not the yang, but the yin. It's not the hand, but the space, the energized space around the hand. One of the great Chinese mystical Taoist philosophers we will look at from time to time, Chuang-Tzu. He lived about the time that Alexander the Great lived, in the 300s BC. He tells the story about this Taoist butcher who carved these oxen at ceremony with incredible speed, and he never sharpened his knife. And it drew the attention of the emperor, who called him forth and said, "Why is it that all of these other butchers are constantly dulling their knives and needing to sharpen their knives, and they need to do this many times to carve even one ox, and yet you, year after year, use this same knife and quickly carve up oxen and never dull your knife? How does this happen?" And the butcher presented the knife for the emperor's inspection, and he said, "This knife is no different from any other knife, but the way in which I cut in between the bones, in between the muscles. The knife never touches anything, and therefore it never needs sharpening. And so a Taoist splits the pairedness of reality, and by splitting the pairedness, never encounters resistance in the first place. Now this is poignant in terms of the I Ching. For the I Ching sets up this quality of appreciative mystery. One wouldn't call Chuangzi a philosopher. One wouldn't call him really a thinker. One would call him an appreciative mystical poet. This appreciative mystical poetry is set in motion by the I Ching. Now, the very first person in Chinese civilization, the first man out of which Chinese civilization began, was named Fu Shi, and is he who is the originator of the I Ching. Fu Shi. Fu Shi is characterized by long hair, long mustache, long beard, crackling eyes that are slanted, long fingernails, long toenails, gnarled bare feet, wearing a leopard skin, and usually presented crouched in a seat looking at the ground. And on the ground, on one side, is a tortoise, and on the other side, written by a finger in the dust, are 8 symbolic marks called trigrams. And it's the correlation, it's the pairing, correlation of the tortoise, because the tortoise shell was used originally in divination. But it's the correlation of the tortoise and its divinatory shell with a series of 8 symbolic trigrams. That's the beginning, the origin of the I Ching. There's something free and wild in Fu Shi, for what he has done is allowed for the human spirit to go in between a pair which on one side is a symbolic expression, on the other side is a mystical expression. And the pair of mystic and symbolic together is what Fu Shi splits and goes through, never touching either one. The I Ching, at its origins, makes this point, that thought characterized by symbols juxtaposes itself to mystery expressed in nature, and that someplace in between nature and mind, man moves freely, wildly, and encountering no resistances is eternal. The Chinese say of such a person that they are a shen, a spirit, a living spirit, and that they are free to be both in nature and in mind at the same time. Such a person is presented later on in Chinese history as wandering through mountains and streams without end. The mountains and streams being a kind of an energy wave current, nature expressed as an endless energy wave, and man able to ride this energy wave. Not as a cork bobbing up and down on the energy wave, but as a Taoist who moves in between the paired qualities of occurrence of that energy wave. And what is in between those paired occurrences is Tao. Now, for the Chinese, we've talked about the 5-phase energy cycle already. And we've talked about yin and yang already. The pair of yin and yang. That when they are together, their togetherness can be expressed as the Tai Chi, the Chinese symbol of the yin and yang together. And we'll look at that in just a moment. But this Tai Chi is not just there as some kind of bounded definition. It's not just a term which registers statically as an identity, but it is an occurrence which has its energy flow. It has an ecology of its occurrence. It has a cycle of its being. And this cycle is the 5 phases. So that yin and yang play together, occur together in a 5-phase energy cycle. Much later, 3,000 years after Fu Xi, the Chinese genius saw into this, that meant that if you were going to characterize, in a way, all of the parts, all of the elements, the entire structure, that one would have a 2 times 5 structure, a 10-part structure. And in Chinese philosophy and thought, about 3,000 years after Fu Xi, they called this the 10 heavenly stems. The 10 heavenly stems. But paying attention to an aspect which we'll see after the break, they realized that at the very center, the center cannot be a singular quality, but the center always has a paired quality. And so the 10 heavenly stems became available in a variant on this earth as a 12-part cycle, because the center repeats twice as a pair of pairs. And so the 10 heavenly stems were complemented by a corollary variation called the 12 earthly branches. And when one puts together the 12 earthly branches and allows for that 12-part whole to move through the 5-phase energy cycle, then you get 5 times 12, or 60. You get a sexagenary energy cycle which includes all of the elements together. And here in Master Ni's version of the I Ching, you have 3 varieties of the sexagenary cycle. You can have it in the form here on the right, or in the form here on the left. And we won't explicate these at this particular time, a little later. And then the third variation is here on the following page on the right. We don't want to get bogged down in trying to master esoteric sexagenary cycles. You can do that on your own. But what's important here is to understand that not only does 5 times 12 amount to 60, but 10 times 6 also amounts to 60. And there is a sexagenary cycle, a 60-part cycle for the Earth, which is the 12 branches going through an energy phase of 5, but there is a 10 celestial stems going through a 6-part cycle, making another sexagenary cycle. So that to later, more sophisticated Chinese civilization, the Han Chinese, contemporaneous with the Romans, with the Roman Empire, the Han Empire was every bit as large and powerful as the Roman Empire. The Han Chinese, which we will get to in a couple of weeks, saw that these 2 60-part cycles were like the double wheels of a chariot, that the comprehensive person rode on these 2 wheels of comprehension and could understand in detail all of the happenings of life, whether celestial or earthly. And a whole new level of Chinese civilization came out of this. We're concerned right now was simply appreciating 5,000 years ago the way in which Fu Xi saw that with 1 and 0 operating as a pair, that their interpenetration meant that there was then a quality of ratioed expression which must always be true. And so yang was expressed as an unbroken line, just simply a line in the dust with a finger. Yin was expressed as a broken line, same finger, same dust. The difference is that the broken line symbolized that there was a 0 quality being expressed, the unbroken line that there was a 1 quality being expressed, and that the 0 and the 1 always occurred together as a pair. One would like to know then, why is it that the diagrams in the dust around the feet of Fu Xi 5,000 years ago were not pairs of lines, but were triads of lines? And when you add a third line to the pairs, the broken and unbroken lines in pairs make a permutation of 4 different kinds. 2 lines that are unbroken together, 2 lines that are broken together, a broken line on top, an unbroken line on top. The permutations are 4. But when you add a third line, it doubles the permutations. Instead of 4, you get 8. And when we come back from the break, we'll take a look at how the trigrams were formed. Let's come back with our companion, Thoreau. Thoreau's our first companion here. Thoreau says, through writing, no face which can give to a matter will stead us so well at last as the truth. This alone wears well. For the most part, we are not where we are, but in a false position. Through an infirmity in our natures, we suppose a case and put ourselves into it, and hence are in 2 cases at the same time, and is doubly difficult to get out. Notice how subtle Thoreau was, how refined. In sane moments, we regard only the facts, the case that is. Say what you have to say, not what you ought. Any truth is better than make-believe. Tom Hyde, the tinker, standing on the gallows, was asked if he had anything to say. He said, "Tell the tailors to remember to make a knot in their thread before they take the first stitch." Let's come back to the I Ching. Let's come back to the pair to this. Later Chinese thought is as developed as Western thought, and one finds, for instance, in the great History of Chinese Philosophy, in 2 volumes, Feng Yulan, translated by Dirk Bode, Princeton University Press. You find on page 459 of volume 2, Cho Tunyi and Xiao Yung, their diagram of the way in which the Supreme Ultimate splits into yin and yang split, and that split splits, and finally, after several levels, one comes to the development of the hexagrams, the 64 hexagrams. And if you look at this particular way of splitting, and by ordering the levels of the splitting and keeping track, you move from 1 to 64 in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 levels. And this split is very reminiscent of the Alexandrian split called the Sieve of Eratosthenes, here in Manly Hall's great encyclopedia of occult philosophy. The Sieve of Eratosthenes of Alexandria, of about 2,300 years ago, is the Pythagorean way of taking an index of odd numbers and factoring in the levels of what is expressively real. Chinese thought, Pythagorean thought, are exactly honed in together, so much so that a book even appeared from the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics was Pythagoras Chinese. Well, of course, Pythagoras is not Chinese. But the fact is, the principles of mathematics on this level of structure are universal. They hold everywhere and for all time. The radical insight of Pythagoras was that limited and unlimited, perion and aperion, are a pair. And it's the same insight that Fuxi had by seeing that 0 and 1 are a pair. That the 0 is the mysterious Tao that cannot be quantified, and yet is there, is operative, and is noticeably operative when one moves from levels to other levels to other levels in a serial order of resonance. 1, 10, 100, 1000 are all differentiable because of the intensity of the 0 base. 10 has a 0 base which is expressively constant, whereas the 1 has it implicit. The 100 has it doubled, the 1000 tripled, and so forth, so that the levels exponentially, as they rise in a seriated order, which are energized sets of the power of the 0. The void has great power when put into further differential energy levels. And when we get to the second year of this program, we will find that consciousness is the consonance of the synergy of the powers of 0 becoming expressive in ourselves. But right now, we need to lay a base for this. And the base is the integration to the point of 0. And the whole first year is a movement of moving from nature. Nature as a matrix of the real. Nature as not a collection of things statically, but as the woven, shimmering mystery of all the processes that there are in their exacting ratios, in their profound relationalities, and to let that nature occur through us in 3 levels of integration. One is existence, the second is experience, and the third is essence. The first is in ritual, the second in myth, the third in symbols. Existence will be expressed in ritual, experience in myth, and essence in symbol. And this 3-part integration participates with the 0 base of nature and makes a 4-square quaternary of wholeness, 3 parts of which are available and 1 part of which is not available for inspection except as it affects the intensification of levels of development. The old Chinese phrase was, heaven has 3 kings, and our king that we see is the 4th. And this is exactly the complement to earth having the 3 kings and the 4th being in heaven. It's this kind of complementation that is characteristic not only of the I Ching, but of Thoreau, of this level of understanding, and it begins in both these with nature. Nature not as things, not as a grab bag of defined, bounded, identified things, but as a matrix of process of change. Now in Fu Xi, that dragon man at the origins of Chinese civilization, understanding the I Ching, making the I Ching, the book of changes, his understanding went as far as making the trigrams explicit and the hexagrams mysteriously unknown. There were hexagrams in Fu Xi's time, but they were not understood. The hexagrams were understood 2,000 years later. And the individuals, the pair of individuals who understood them, initiated a whole new phase of Chinese civilization. They founded what was called the Zhou dynasty. Used to be spelled C-H-O-U, pronounced Zhou. And the Zhou dynasty was the 3rd dynasty. Fu Xi had initiated the Xia dynasty, and the Xia included the 5 legendary kings. And then it had run its course and become degenerate, and a whole new dynastic family came into play called the Shang. And the Shang dynasty, the 2nd dynasty, were the ones who were symbolized by these copper vessels, the ting, the cauldron, the hu, the pouring pitcher, the tripods and the various things, cast bronze. That is to say, metal that is poured, taken out of the earth and melted by man and then poured into man-made forms. The metal which grows as the veins of the earth, taking the blood of the earth, the metallic blood of the earth, out of the veins and re-infusing it into man-made ritual forms, the ceremonial bronzes of the Shang. And just as bronze, cast bronze ceremonial vessels are the hallmark of the Shang, the Zhou dynasty is radically different from the Shang. Their symbol is not a metal ritual vessel, but a jade symbolic stone. The circular jade with the hole in the middle of it, called the B, sometimes in English spelled as P-I, but pronounced B. It's like this circle of jade around an openness. That was the symbol of the Zhou, and the Zhou are the ones who made the I Ching what we know it today. And the founders of the Zhou, King Wen and his brother, the Duke of Zhou, are the ones who wrote the original enlargements, the original prose, insightful, resonant additions to Fu Xi's original order. Fu Xi's original order was a pristine mystical insight into the way in which heaven worked and stamped earth with its form. The Zhou understanding was the way in which heaven worked through man, and man, with the heavenly energy, stamped his form. So that you had an earth pattern for the Zhou centered on man who had received divine energy, Whereas the original I Ching was the heavenly energy unmediated by man. Man was subconscious, unconscious, and it came directly into the forms. The trigrams were natural, heavenly symbols that came together in natural, heavenly ways to make the hexagrams, but the meaning was from the Zhou dynasty, where heavenly man understood what they meant, what they were. And so the I Ching that comes down to us is known alternatively not just as the I Ching, but as the Book of Zhou. And the Zhou dynasty, when it is founded, has some of the poems celebrating itself from, this translation is called the Book of Songs, Arthur Waley. Sometimes it's also called the Book of Odes, Bernard Kuhlgren. These are the two great translations into English. The earliest, the first collection of Chinese literature, the very first. God said to King Wen, I am moved by your bright power. Your high renown has not made you put on proud airs. Your greatness has not made you change former ways. You do not try to be clever or knowing, but follow God's precepts. And another poem begins, when he built the magic tower, when he planned it and founded it, all the people worked at it. In less than a day they finished it. Yet when he built it, there was no goading, yet the people came in their throngs. The king was in the magic park, where doe and stag lay hid. Doe and stag at his coming leapt and bounded. The white herons gleamed so sleek. The king, by the magic pool, where fish sprang lithely. The I Ching comes from the experience of a man like King Wen and his brother, the Duke of Zhou, and their experience enlarged what was the original I Ching to the I Ching which we would begin to recognize. An I Ching which then was capable of a third further development, about 500 years after King Wen, after the founding of the Zhou dynasty, when the Zhou was in an intermediary period. A universal genius named Lao Tzu occurred on the Chinese civilized landscape. In Lao Tzu's book, Tao Ching. Tao Te as a pair. Tao paired with Te. 0 paired with 1. That book. The book of Tao Te Ching. When Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching appeared, it was like a shaft of mystical insight into the structure of the Book of Zhou, such that the next generation after Lao Tzu centered around the person of Confucius, Kung Fu Tzu. Confucius was able, like the King Wen and the Duke of Zhou, to enlarge the resonance of writing about the I Ching. And so the Confucian commentaries, called wings, were added to the Book of Zhou. And so the I Ching that we have today, classically, is formulated on 3 different levels of resonance. Fu Shi, King Wen and the Duke of Zhou, Confucius, with his insight spurred by Lao Tzu. So the I Ching has this tertiary relationship. And because that tertiary relationship was so profound, at the beginning of the Han Dynasty, about 500 years after Confucius, they froze the I Ching as one of the classics. They froze its form. Just like at the Council of Jamnia, 90 of the Common Era, Council of Rabbis decided that the Torah would never be modified, edited, changed. And the Masoretic text of the Torah of 90 AD is exactly, to every iota, the same text that you would find in a synagogue today. The same thing happened with the Chinese classics. And in the Han Dynasty, your whole place in the hierarchy of the king's service, the Chinese civil service, was how well you did on the state exams. And the state exams, like a law test, like a law bar exam, were administered every year. And everyone studied the same classics. And the cycle of the classics began and ended with the I Ching. And so once upon a time, the study of the I Ching was the beginning and the end of the entire rational and understandable order of Chinese civilization. And that lasted down to 1912. And it never changed. Dynasties changed. Land forms changed. But the civil service exams never changed. But in that time period, progressively, the understanding of the I Ching became formalized, formulated, granulated. 1,000 years ago already, someone brilliant like Chu Shi was writing commentaries about how, over the centuries, the understanding of the I Ching had slowly skewed itself and inched itself away until, in his time, around 1000 AD, 1100 AD, in that time period, he could write with confidence, "No one of my time understands the I Ching." And Chu Shi initiated a radical reinvestigation of Chinese civilization using the I Ching as the crowbar, as the pry bar. And out of this came a whole movement called Neo-Confucianism. Just like around the time of the 1st century of the Common Era, Neo-Pythagoreanism was the great intellectual ferment, Neo-Confucianism. And Neo-Confucianism lasted in its development for about 500 years until a great universal genius named Wang Yang Ming, around the time of Erasmus, around 1500, came to understand that what needed to be done was to take the Neo-Confucian crowbar of Fu Shi out of the hands of a Confucian-based mentality and put it into a shared synergy of Lao Tzu and Confucius together, which allowed one to go back to the original insight into the way in which the Zhou dynasty resonantly enlarged Fu Shi's original I Ching. And with Wang Yang Ming, who was a kind of a universal genius on the level of Leonardo da Vinci, Chinese civilization reached another apex of greatness about 500 years ago. We don't have to go into all of that. I just thought that you'd like to know that the book that we're pairing up with Thoreau is the spinal column of East Asian civilization. It is the way in which that whole civilization was generated in the first place. The I Ching is the Torah of East Asia. The center of this is the very simple, seeming, radical understanding that 0 and 1 play together, and when they play, whatever they play is real. And that if the two are separated, one begins to get an illusion on one side and a forgetfulness on the other. 0 becomes not knowing, and 1 becomes a static mask of illusory. and that only by keeping them together does forgetfulness and illusion not happen as a paired ignorance, but instead a paired wisdom occurs, which one could then say man has understood as a bridge between heaven and earth, between the oneness of earth and the zero mysteriousness of heaven, that man is a bridge between heaven and earth. And with heaven and earth and man bridging them, you have this triad. You have this triangle. You have this trinity. You have this three quality, this triple quality. And the three lines of the trigrams are to keep the resonance of this heaven, man, and earth together. Now, one of the clues of this, which has never been talked about in any of the wings, which I have added to it, my friend Kai D, who had passed away a year or two ago, was the only American to ever receive a Taoist imprimatur, a Taoist degree from the White Cloud Monastery outside of Beijing. And Kai D wrote a commentary on the I Ching called The 11th Wing. And it is out of print now, but we have a copy here. An insight that I got with some conversations with Kai D in 1975. I'd come to Los Angeles to teach a course on symbolic consciousness at UCLA Extension, and across the room from me was Stephen Heller lecturing on 7 Sermons to the Dead, Carl Jung's Gnostic vision, and in the room next to me was Kai D lecturing on the I Ching and the 11th Wing. And I thought, I've come to the right place. You can't go wrong. And the first thing that Kai D said to me is, in a conversation, I learned that my good friend Theodore Sturgeon, the science fiction writer, was a very good friend of his. And so I thought, well, I'm home. The radical addition that I have brought to the I Ching is, let's use the term concept, the concept of grandfather phasing. Grandfather phasing. It's an American Indian wisdom. We always have trouble relating to the father. We always have some trouble relating to the mother. It is the grandfather, it is the grandmother who are able to teach wisdom to us. The mother and father teach us world things. The grandmother and the grandfather teach us wisdom things. In grandfather phasing, every other phase in the 5-phase energy cycle work together. So if you have Tao, Te, and the third phase is Gen. Gen is usually human-heartedness. It's us. But notice it's at the middle. The fourth phase is characterized as E. We would call E symbols, like the trigrams or the hexagrams of the I Ching, or E. The fifth phase are Li. Later on in Confucian civil service definitions, Li would become principle. But Li, originally, that Li is the world of 10,000 things, as the Chinese say. In other words, in multiplicity, the Chinese phrase is 10,000 things. The realm of multiplicity, the realm of zero, the realm of oneness, the realm of the dual, polarized, yet capable of transforming into a complementation, Gen, the E as the mind shapes, and the Li as the realm of multiplicity. Every other phase in this grandfather phasing, or grandmother phasing if you like, every other phase has a resonant quality. So that if you take Te and E, if you take oneness, the power of oneness, Te is sometimes translated as power, or sometimes as virtue. It means the ability to be. Te, the power to be. The Te is, in a grandfather phasing way, resonant with I. The power of symbols is because they are resonant with Te. Te allows for things to be, and symbols, they allow for something else to be. The powers of the mind are like the powers of nature. They manifest. This book is not manifested like a tree, but manifested out of the mind in a grandfather phased resonance of the E of this book resonating with the Te of paper, ink, volume, space, so they work together. If the fourth place is resonant with the second, then the third place is resonant with the first. The second place was Te, the first place was Tao. Tao is resonant with Zhen. Our human-heartedness is resonant with Tao. There's something about our reality and the reality of Tao that form a pair. And just as Zhen is resonant with Tao, it also, on the other side, is resonant with the 10,000 things. Man is resonant with the world of multiplicity. Notice here that man is not resonant with oneness. He's resonant with the mysteriousness of zero and with multiplicity. Man is the bridge between the mystery of zero and multiplicity. This Zhen, in this grandfather phasing way, is understood as a Chinese Taoist would understand it. Notice here that the I Ching symbols, the Li resonant with Zhen, the I resonant with Te, the I Ching symbols in the fourth place are resonant with oneness. So that the symbols of the I Ching are derived not from Tao and not from man, but they are derived from Te. And the efficacy, the power of the symbols of the I Ching are because they are, in a grandfather phased way, paired with Te. So that the symbols of the I Ching all begin in their expressive vitality as manifestors with the one, so that one then has that Tai Chi. Now we say a Tai Chi symbol, but one has to do a little bit of a shift here and realize that the expressive symbol of the Tai Chi is in the fourth phase. The actual efficacy of it is not in any kind of symbol, but in its operative manifestation. The real Tai Chi, as my spirit mother used to tell me, she presented me with a pair of Chinese figures. One of them was a farmer with his hoe, and the other was a scholar with his book. And she said to me one time, she said, work and study are the real Tai Chi. That's what really gives the power in life to someone, is when your work and study are paired together. You get a synergy that flows, and if you can modulate that to that 5-phase energy cycle, it's like a yoga. You can go forever. This quality, where we are in a grandfather phased way paired with Tao, not with Te, means that when we base the forms of our life upon Te, upon power, we're out of phase with the real. When we base the forms of our expression, like politics, on the Tao, we're in phase, and then we are able to participate in an energy ecology, which Thoreau would recognize is not only natural, but as mysteriously real for us. In a way, Thoreau is a very, very great Taoist. There is a passage in Thoreau, in the journal, this is from his journal. This is page 579 of the Portable Thoreau. The North River is not frozen over. I see tree sparrows twittering and moving with a low creeping and jerking motion amid the canopodium on a field upon the snow. So chubby or puffed out, these sparrows jumping around in the cold, so chubby and puffed out on account of the cold, that at first I took them for the Arctic birds, but soon I see their bright chestnut crowns and clear white bars. As the poet says, 1,000 feeding as one, though there are not more than a dozen here. It's just this kind of quality of seeing instantly in nature the mystery of Tao operating. When man sees the power operating and identifies himself with controlling that power operating, he shorts out the efficacy of symbols of the mind forms and usurps them for himself. But because the world of 10,000 things follows in the fifth phase from the correct handling of symbols in the mind, if that ecology is stopped up, it's just like a civilization or a culture needing acupuncture. The energy is stopped up, and the natural efficacy of symbols in the mind do not create a bounteous kind of multiplicity. Where is that multiplicity going to go? What happens to it in the energy cycle? The fifth phase comes back and factors into the Tao. And so there's a flow. The fifth phase goes back into the first. If everything occurs in its natural sequence, multiplicity factors back into the Tao without leaving a trace. But if the symbols are usurped by a misunderstanding, ignorant Gen, because the Gen identifies itself with power on the level of Te, you get misshapen symbols. You get artificial symbols. And they make an artificial multiplicity that doesn't factor into Tao. And so you have junk. Instead of things flowing back into nature, you have plastic containers that will never disintegrate. You have concrete with rebar sticking into the mountain streams. You have asphalt pieces laying knee-deep on what used to be farmland. And if you take an ocean voyage, you find that all the currents of the oceans of the planet are littered with the flotsam and jetsam that you see occasionally on beaches when the tide comes in. And that the whole planet is ringed, instead of with currents of life in the oceans, ringed with floating junkyards. So massive that one could even see them from space now. Because the multiplicity doesn't factor back into Tao without leaving a trace. It's not a blame, but it's like a stopped up energy flow that needs an acupuncture exactly at this point. What point? At the point of Gen. Specifically at the point of Gen, of identifying with power instead of identifying resonantly with Tao. Because when man understands that he is paired in a grandfather-phased way with Tao, that Tao operates through him. His multiplicity is so natural, it flows back into Tao without leaving a trace. And because the fifth phase of his multiplicity factors into Tao, it resonates with Te. So the world of things has its power, but after being mediated by Tao. And it's just in this way that a doctor of civilization with a Taoist understanding would apply the cure. Our course, by using a pair of Thoreau and the I Ching to begin with, this is the first of a whole series of paired texts which we will use throughout the 2-year cycle. One cycle for integration, one cycle for differentiation. 4 seasons of bringing together, 4 seasons of letting things variate. In order to help us, in order to thread through, the original Sanskrit word for thread in this sense was sutra, the thread that will string these gems and make a necklace of our learning. The thread will be some kind of a journey, and I have chosen 2 kinds of journey. I've chosen a masculine journey and I've chosen a feminine journey. In the form of books, in the form of a pair of books, to keep it consonant with what we're using. When you become acquainted with set theory, you have to pay attention to what it is that you're using and what the proportions and order. Logic can be very helpful if it's truthful, and very, very upsetting if it has illusion in it. And confusion of sets, confusion of types is a notorious bad mentality. Most of the schools in operation today have such a confusion of types that someone like Bertrand Russell, who originated the theory of types out of work done by Cantor and Meinong and so forth, simply discounted popular education. The pair of books I've used is Homer's Odyssey and Melville's Moby Dick. Moby Dick is a masculine journey. The Odyssey is a feminine journey. Don't worry about the Odyssey being written by a man. All of the moving elements in Odysseus's movement are women. Penelope, Nausicaa, Circe, all of them. This quality of the Odyssey I will try to emphasize for you next week when we start out. I will play for you the sound of someone reading the Iliad in the original Greek, and then for just a minute, and then reading a minute of the Odyssey in the original Greek. And you will hear the radical difference. The Iliad is a masculine form of the adventure, and the Odyssey was the feminine form. As someone observed once, the Iliad sounds like the grim, determined launching of a gray battleship in a fog, only meant for war and death. Whereas the Odyssey has the light, skipping, tripping, moving melody of some kind of surprise adventure, a romance of incredible importance awaiting one who participates in life. Instead of the Iliad, we're going to look at Moby Dick, which is very much like the Iliad. You can choose either one, either the Odyssey or Moby Dick, and I've arranged throughout the first year a proportioned set of readings. Now, if you don't have time, you just don't have time. But if you do have time, it takes about 25 minutes for each week just to read these little extracts. If you do it, don't jump ahead. The whole purpose is not to read a book. And the Cliff Notes are not going to help. The whole purpose is to give ourselves some kind, it's like a metronome. It's like a sense of pacing. And the pacing has to last. Mae West once said, "I like a man who takes his time." The pacing has to last so that when we go through the entire cycle, when we get to the 52nd week, it should be exhausted. We should run out of fuel exactly then. Because the very last step of integration is acceptance. You have to coast into eternity. You can't power throttle into eternity. You have to coast in. You have to run out of gas 1 minute before you're there. And still it's possible to enjoy the old Irish toast. May you be in heaven a half hour before the devil knows you're dead. More next week.